This is the ICO Alert Podcast, episode 22. I'm your host, Robert Finch, founder of ICO Alert. ICO Alert maintains the only comprehensive list of every single initial coin offering. That includes all of the active ICOs that are happening now, as well as all of the upcoming ICOs. You can check out the full list on our website at icoalert.com. My guest today is Amy Wan, the founder and CEO of Bootstrap Legal. During the podcast, Amy will help clarify the current state of cryptocurrencies and ICOs in the United States from the perspective of a securities attorney. She'll also give her insight into recent SEC announcements about the DAO, celebrity endorsements, and more. Without further ado, let's get to it. Amy, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And we were just talking before the call about Bitcoin, which, if you're living under a rock somewhere, just hit $16,000. It's pretty crazy.
Yes, I am totally swooning.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are right now, kind of, waiting to see if it'll keep going. Will it come down? What will happen? But it should be an interesting week and probably an interesting weekend as well. But it's great to have you. First, could you start out just by, kind of introducing yourself, explaining who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am a securities attorney by training, although I've been in legal tech for the past couple years. Started my career off in federal government, really actually doing international trade law, international regulatory affairs. Moved from DC back to LA a couple years ago and was general counsel of a real estate crowdfunding platform. And at that time, the new crowdfunding laws were just coming out. Most recently was partner at a boutique securities firm. And at some point, I basically, thought that I could automate parts of my job. So I left. I started Bootstrap Legal. Our first product was automating the drafting of real estate, private equity, and crowdfunding documents. And as we were... And so that's live today. It's sitting there and it's working and, it's making money. So I'm happy.
Right.
And, we were looking into expanding the product into other verticals. And so, around the time that we actually released the launch of our real estate product, that's when the SEC came out with their DAO press release. And of course, all the law firms increased the cost of legal representation, just overnight because of that. So the margin suddenly went really high. Wow. We looked into automating, ICO legal documents, ultimately concluded that now is not the right time. There's not enough standardizations. There's not enough regulatory clarity, but actually ended up finding or, realizing that there was something else that was a fundamental underpinning issue to all of this, and that is the vulnerability of smart contracts. So today, we are actually working on a new project to solve this problem. And I don't know if you wanted me to get into it now or we can talk about it later, but yeah, that's the focus of the company now.
Yeah, that sounds great. Could you tease for us, what is it that you guys are working on now?
Yeah, so essentially what we realized, over, I would say, spring and early summer, when I would see all these ICOs pop up on my LinkedIn feed or, my other social media, in the first 15 minutes, it was like all these ICOs were getting hacked, maybe $2-3 million, and the founders would sit there and they would shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, sorry, there's nothing that we can do. And I was like, wait, this doesn't happen in the real world. Like, you don't just lose $2 or $3 million and sit there and say, oops, right?
Right.
And I was thinking like, man, this is like, this has been going on since the days of the DAO, except the DAO was like a $50-60 million loss. And I was like, what's going on here? And so as we dug deeper into the issue, we realized that actually smart contracts many times are not actually that smart. They're actually incredibly vulnerable. You've got coding errors, you've got, vulnerabilities, right? So the hack against the DAO, that was not a hack against the terms of the smart contract. What the hacker did was they found a loophole, right? They found a vulnerability in the code. And then at the end of the day, in my experience, it is that human beings are the most creative species on planet Earth. They literally can come up with anything. And the truth is situations change, right? So people need flexibility. I do believe that they will need to amend, modify, and terminate their smart contracts. And so what we're doing is we're building one line of code. It's an SDK that anyone can put into their smart contract. And to the extent the smart contract is ever executing in a way that the parties do not intend, the parties can simply trigger that code. It freezes execution of the smart contract, kicks the entire thing over into a dispute resolution marketplace. We're not a dispute resolution service provider, and I can talk about that in a second if you'd like me to.
Yeah.
And then for a lot of logistical and cultural reasons, the entire thing sits on top of a borderless digital jurisdiction, because even if you can get across those logistical hurdles, right, like even knowing who the other contracting party is, because half the time you don't, right? Even if you know who the other party is so that you can actually serve them something or file a complaint in court, I say have fun explaining to your counsel, judge, or jury, all of whom think that anything Bitcoin related is inherently fraudulent or illegal. Have fun explaining to them your smart contract. Oh, by the way, they can't read it because less than 1% of the population can read code. And so now you need an expert witness. It just gets so complicated. So we're essentially building legal and dispute resolution infrastructure for smart contracts and bringing the legal process on chain, but utilizing 21st century technology to actually make it more efficient and user-friendly. It's really meant to be a crypto and blockchain-friendly private jurisdiction.
Wow, that's awesome. There's a lot to unpack there, specifically with the DAO. For those that maybe new to the space, maybe you didn't go through the Ethereum DAO hack, but basically the DAO was the first almost pooled investment fund, if you want to call it that, where people could, put in a bunch of Ether and then vote on who they wanted those funds to go to. And long story short, it got up to, more than $100 million. And eventually somebody found an exploit and drained the contract of all of its money. If they had, your new tool in the DAO smart contract and the ability to pause it, how do you think that situation would have played out? Would it have been totally different? Would, less funds have been stolen?
Sure. So here's there's a couple of things to unpack in that question, right? So the first is, could they have stopped it? And so what our SDK does is it has a number of certain different functionalities, right? And amongst one of those, for example, is a time lock functionality. And so people would have been able to see what the execution would have been before the execution happened, right? So they could have stopped or at least triggered the code to activate and frozen the smart contract right there before it got drained, so that they wouldn't have to hard fork the entire system. And then in the actual dispute resolution process, right? If you look at the old threads of people discussing, oh man, what do we do now after the DAO? Some people were like, oh, let's call police, although they didn't even know which police to call and which jurisdiction. Other people were saying, no, code is law. Other people were like, you know what? I lost money. I want my money back, right? Like whenever someone loses their money, they're not happy. Like suddenly all this technology becomes very real. The reason earlier why I mentioned a dispute resolution marketplace as opposed to just providing a dispute resolution service is because of this. Dispute resolution is not a one-size-fits-all thing, right? So maybe for a DAO type organization, you would have dispute resolution in the way they ended up doing it, which is essentially people voting based on their stakes. But there are so many other situations I can think of where that type of dispute resolution doesn't work. So for example, if you and I made a bar bet, right, for, I don't know, $10.
Right.
First of all, it doesn't make sense to have human beings even involved in that. It's a small financial microtransaction. The cost of human dispute resolution involvement would not be justified, right? Human beings inherently raise transactional cost. And so that's the type of transaction that should be, resolved by a bot, right? If you look at PayPal, eBay's bot, they resolve over 60 million disputes a year, only maybe 5% of which are ever touched by a human.
Wow, really? That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about other types of disputes, right? Like there are times and places where maybe you do want to fall back on traditional processes. So let's say you, I don't know, you're doing an ICO and you have a smart contract with some celebrity to promote, hopefully within the securities laws, right?
Right.
And so you're paying them by smart contract, and suddenly there's a dispute. Well, now this is too sensitive. There's too much at stake probably for a bot to handle. But at the same time, celebrities are very sensitive about their contracts. They're not going to want a bunch of crowd jurors or, random people out there voting for what it would be, right? They would probably see that as mob justice. So they're not going to want that sort of solution. Maybe they're going to opt for some private panel of professional arbitrators to keep everything confidential and secret and to have a very professional dispute resolution procedure. And so, our approach is we're not here to prescribe what's the best solution. We're merely here to provide that infrastructure so people can get their disputes resolved, their crypto disputes resolved much more efficiently, and at least they'll have some outlet, as opposed to what's happening right now, which is people getting hacked left and right, and every time they hard fork Ethereum, you're basically choosing winners and losers.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, to talk about the jurisdictionless aspect of this, how can something actually be jurisdictionless? Because I had somebody email me the other day saying, hey, I'm interested in running a jurisdictionless ICO. Do you have any advice? And my only advice was really just good luck, because first of all, I don't want to give out advice over email, but good luck convincing the SEC that you are in fact jurisdictionless, or any other regulatory body for that matter. So how is it possible that what you're doing with this arbitration is really jurisdictionless?
Yeah, so I think that really comes a lot into legal design, right? We have a pre-existing patchwork today of laws from different sovereignties, different countries, and not only that, even different states, counties, cities, local laws, for example, and they all overlap each other, right? So what we are proposing is a jurisdiction that does not necessarily, what is the term? It doesn't overtake any other jurisdiction. It merely is a private jurisdiction that people can opt into, and people can transact and resolve their transactional disputes. It does not, and I have to look further into this and do a little bit of legal research, but I don't think necessarily that you can say, hey, I live in the U.S., I want to sell to U.S. investors, but I'm going to opt into this private jurisdiction, and that's going to get me outside the boundaries of SEC law. That I don't think is possible.
Yeah, if that was the case, every single ICO would just launch in Switzerland and still sell to U.S. investors and get around all the SEC laws, and every hedge fund for that matter too.
Yeah. But we're not here to do that. We're just trying to make it easier for people to get justice.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so interesting having a securities attorney on on this show just because we can talk about a lot of the recent SEC events. So it's interesting in crypto, some of these recent SEC events have gotten a lot of press when it's something about celebrity ICO endorsements, for example, like Floyd Mayweather and Paris Hilton and some of these other celebrities who, came out and endorsed what may be securities without actually explicitly saying that, they were getting paid to do so. But there were a couple other events as well. Obviously, the DAO, was deemed a security. Can we talk about that really briefly before we move on to some other announcements the SEC made?
Yeah, sure. So that is a press release and investigative report that came down July 27th of this year. And basically, it was the SEC's way of firing a warning shot, right? Prior to that, I think even 1 to 2 weeks prior, it was either Times or Newsweek had released an article that said, oh, this is the Wild West. It's an unregulated field. It's actually never been unregulated. It's just that a lot of these people who are doing this stuff are tech people who were not consulting counsel. Counsel would have, been able to say in a second, like, what you're doing is a security.
Right.
And, and even I said this. I wrote an article back in like February or March when I was talking to my CTO about it, right? He was describing the DAO as like, wait, like that's a securities offering. So
wow.
It's never been the case that this space is unregulated. It's mostly right now a matter of clarifying regulations, of clarifying all the, I guess you call it creative thinking that's going on, right? And trying to grapple with, okay, well, to the extent a project or a company tokenizes, what are the ramifications from now all the way down the chain, everything from tax, privacy, even developer liability, right? Those are all very good questions right now.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, too, to kind of see how this develops, because even though, technically it hasn't been unregulated, it feels a lot kind of like the SEC is trying to figure out which box to put cryptocurrencies in. Which box do we put ICOs in? But then you also see the SEC come out and make statements saying that, kind of explicitly stating that all tokens are not securities, but many tokens will be. So there's also some hope, that there still will be these, utility tokens or just pure infrastructure tokens like Bitcoin and Ethereum that will not be securities. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this all develops. The second part that was really interesting to me that was the first thing that I think really affected ICOs was the SEC coming out and essentially exposing two different ICOs, Recoin and then Diamond Reserve Club, as fraudulent and not actually backed respectively by real estate or diamonds. Do you have any thoughts on that and maybe why they did that? Was that warning shot round 2 or was this an actual shot to take somebody down?
So I think the one that came down most recently was PlexCore, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's even another one. So that's the third, I guess, now.
Yeah. So I think there's two types of enforcement actions that we're going to start seeing, right? The first ones are the ones that are obviously fraudulent, right? So, for example, PlexCore, that was, an issuer that was obviously fraudulent. They actually had a background of fraud. They've had to deal with securities regulators before.
Oh, my goodness.
So I know, it's terrible. They were trying to put a stop to it, right? And honestly, there were so many red flags in that particular offering. I'm surprised sometimes when I see what people will invest in. At the same time, there are other enforcement actions that we're still waiting to see. And these enforcement actions, I think, are going to be the type of actions that help to give guidance to legal counsel and to issuers in terms of, okay, is my token a security or not? And what can I actually do with it, right? I think you've heard now at least a couple times that SEC officials have unofficially said, we have not yet seen a token offering that is not a security. And even with their DAO report, right? They were saying, they're basically saying, it is possible for a token to not be a security, but that many of these will be securities. And so, what I'm hearing through back channels is that at least today, 99% of these tokens are securities. Often when I go to these conferences, they've got these panels that are titled utility token versus security token. And I think that's really a misnomer or a false distinction, right? It is possible, I think, to have a utility token that is a security. It just happens to be that the security has some sort of utility function, right? Whereas to me, it's perfectly possible to have what I call a pure utility token, where really there's just a functional use. It really just is a commodity. The problem today, and I've discussed this with a lot of my securities attorneys friends working in this space, is that, to the extent a lot of these ICOs or token sales or ITOs or whatever you want to call them nowadays, by the way, if you change the name of the offering, that doesn't matter one bit.
Exactly. You might as well still call it an ICO because the SEC doesn't care what it's called. Even if you call it a non-security offering, it may still be a security.
Yeah. I love the creativity in this space. Nice try. But really, it's not so much what you say it is or is not. It's how does the token act? What is its behavior, its function? And for you, the promoter or the issuer, when you're selling it, how are you going about selling it, right? Are you, for example, going out and selling it to hedge funds and VCs and are they buying, 10% of all tokens at a time, or are people really actually buying it for some sort of utility use, right? All that stuff really matters. And so I think the problem today is not so much that, that it's very difficult to create a utility token that isn't a security. It's much more that people really actually want the utility token to act like a security. Like if someone structures it in a pure, utility fashion, then you don't have a security. It's pretty simple. It's just that, in all these conversations I'm hearing, it's the ICO issuer that's, going back and forth with counsel being like, well, what if we did this? What if we did this? Because they're trying to get as close to the line as possible with being able to go raise a ton of money, right? But for example, there is a big difference between the ICOs that you're seeing nowadays and, for example, what we saw with Kickstarter, right? You could do a token sale via Kickstarter or Indiegogo, and it would be a pre-sale, and it could still not be a security.
Interesting. And for those listening that are not familiar with securities law, which is probably 99% of people, how are things qualified as a security? Like there's the Howey test, where if it passes or fails, it's either is or is not a security. Does that apply to these ICOs and these tokens as well? Do you think?
Yeah, so there's a couple nuances around that. Generally, the Howey test applies. Alongside the Howey test, there is, decades of securities case law, right? So that's one thing to think about from a federal level, and that is to the extent someone is offering tokens for sale to U.S. investors. Now, one also needs to remember that there are state regulators as well. There's 50 of them, right? And to the extent one says, okay, we're not offering this token under federal securities law, but they perhaps sell to someone in a certain state, or maybe they're not even treating it as a federal security, then suddenly you're subject to the state regulator of every state in which you've taken an investor, right? And like personally for me, I think the SEC has been very understanding of the space. They're being very patient. I would much rather deal with one reasonable regulator than, a horde of 50 state regulators who all have different tests and all have different treatments and all have different and varying levels of, what they think about the crypto space. And then, the other thing to remember is, we live in a crazy, very digital society today, right? So I am aware that there's a lot of ICOs, domestic or foreign, that say more or less on their website or their white paper or whatever that they're not selling to U.S. investors. Some of these even have, like IP address blockers to the extent that you're trying to buy from the United States. But in many ways, even that is not enough because, everyone uses VPNs now as well, right? It's very simple. So just having an IP address detection mechanism is not good enough. There really needs to be more in this space. And I am starting to see a lot of compliance platforms pop up. A lot of ICOs are now starting to get into like AML, KYC, identity verification. And so they're much more able to, identify where their investor is coming from, right? Because let's face it, people online lie all the time.
Right. That's a good point. It's very hard, especially to tell, what is true these days online. Should I buy that coin, or is that person just telling me to buy that coin because they own that coin? And generally that's the case.
Yeah.
But with this especially, you bring up a really good point, which I think we could kind of encapsulate in one word of like self-regulation. It does seem like a lot of these ICOs and a lot of crypto companies are kind of self-regulating even before the SEC has put, a real framework in place or put some clarity in place for these ICOs and for these token offerings. Do you think that's something that will continue? Will people continue to, ramp up on KYC and AML, or do you think it's going to take some huge event of the SEC coming down and striking down a bunch of ICOs saying these are securities and here's why?
I think it's really going to be both, right? Like I am hearing about a lot of initiatives for self-governance, self-regulation. And I actually, when I worked in the federal government, I actually came from a background that looked into regulatory coherence. We worked on international standards, technical barriers to trade and regulatory stuff, the regulatory process. So I've seen this in other industries as well. Self-regulation is always a great thing, right? You want to be able to set standards within an industry, and to the extent that happens, there can be a lot more regulatory cooperation with regulators, but also within the community. The problem with that is that, at least here, I'm not sure that in and of itself it will suffice, because there will always be greedy bad actors who are going to go out, exploit or take advantage of the situation. And, for every honest actor that self-regulates, that tries to undergo best practices, there's going to be an unscrupulous person out there who is like, well, I'm just trying to, get money and run off to Switzerland and buy a chateau. Like, I don't need to self-regulate. I'm just trying to get money. that happens every single day. So we still need to figure out something for to stop all of those folks.
Absolutely. And I mean, that I think will definitely take, the SEC coming in or some other, governmental body coming in and putting in place this regulation. But it's really interesting on that point, just to bring up a story my friend told me. We were talking about, the Diamond Reserve Club and, how they were basically saying that their tokens would be backed by diamonds when they had no intention to really back them and had no experience in that field. At least that's what the SEC says. But I was talking with a friend of mine and he said, oh, no, it's backed by diamonds, but diamonds is just the name of this guy's boat. Like he's going to go out and buy a boat and name it Diamonds, and that'll be the token backed by diamonds. So unfortunately, I think there are some people like that. There are some incredible projects, but unfortunately, with any new technology, we get a lot of these bad actors, and it'll definitely be nice once that's cleaned up a bit. to move on to the next part about celebrity ICO endorsements, and this has been something that's been kind of a hot topic in the crypto space, especially within the core crypto community. And I think the reason why is because a lot of people within the community see these celebrity ICO endorsements as red flags initially. Like if you see Floyd Mayweather, who's not a cryptocurrency personality, he probably doesn't even understand what it is. Floyd, I believe, is actually illiterate, and that's nothing to shame him on, but he's not writing the posts under his Instagram saying to buy into this ICO. So that, and then the Paris Hilton thing, and then some other actresses were all kind of red flags for people within the community. But it also turns out that those may have been illegal. So the SEC came out with, a recent report basically saying that celebrity ICO endorsements may be illegal. And there's a quote that I wanted to read out kind of on that piece of regulation in general, and then perhaps you can add to it and give your thoughts. But it says, celebrities and others are using social media networks to encourage the public to purchase stocks and other investments. These endorsements may be unlawful if they do not disclose the nature, source, and amount of any compensation paid, directly or indirectly, by the company in exchange for the endorsement. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, this is just longstanding law, right? So, well, first of all, let's talk about the concept of celebrity endorsement in general. Yeah. Especially when it relates to like a securities offering or any sort of investment. I mean, like, come on, like if you are taking your investment advice from a celebrity who is not a Shark Tank, a Kevin O'Leary, like someone like that who is known for their investment prowess, I think there's an issue there that, you might want to rethink your investment strategy in general. Definitely. But aside from that, yes, there are a lot of securities laws and other laws that govern this space, whether or not it is a security, right? So on the securities aspect, first of all, whether you're a celebrity or an advisor or a crypto influencer or just anyone that is promoting an ICO offering, there's one very important thing that people should know, and that is that they cannot take commissions. In the securities world, commissions are something that we basically call transaction-based compensation. If your compensation is based on the transaction, whether it's its size or even whether or not it's successful or if it happens, that's very problematic. You do have to be licensed as a registered broker-dealer. Otherwise, you are breaking what we call broker-dealer laws. Really only broker-dealers can take transaction-based compensation. Now, that's not to say you can't take other forms or structures of compensation, but it certainly should not be tied to the success of the raise. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, to the extent someone is taking any compensation, it is always a good practice to disclose it. And this is whether it's a security or not, right? Even if you're looking at a celebrity endorsing some product, right? Like, dish soap or whatever. A lot of the times you will see little disclaimers or whatever in a lot of that advertising that says, so-and-so was paid to endorse this product. Right now on social media, there's a lot of social media influencers who get paid to promote certain products, and the more professional ones, at least, will clearly disclose that they're being compensated, right? So whether it's a security or not, people should and often must disclose their relationships. So, some of these, for example, I'm on a lot of the Facebook crypto groups. Some of the groups are, I would say well moderated. There's a pinned post at the top that says, you must disclose your affiliation with any ICO. I run like a tokenomics Facebook group, and you are basically not allowed to promote your ICO at all. And of course, there are other ones that are maybe not so well moderated, but even if that's the case, people should be disclosing.
Definitely. So do you think that retroactively somebody like Floyd Mayweather or Paris Hilton will have to go back and say, this ICO gave me $500,000 or whatever to post this? Or do you think there will just be some other kind of action taken by the SEC?
Oh, gosh. It really depends on the compensation structure, I think. But really, if someone's acting as a promoter, especially, for example, if they're a celebrity and they have a lot to lose, I mean, they really need to be talking to their counsel because, they may have a lot of angry people coming after them in the future, and they may be liable for some of their actions.
Definitely, yeah, especially people like Floyd Mayweather who, Instagram posts of them writing $100 million checks from one bank account to the other. So I think, he's got some things to worry about for sure. But I really appreciate your insight on that. I mean, there are a lot of people listening to this podcast who I'm sure had a lot of aha moments or like, I finally understand, what made the DAO a security. So I really appreciate all the insight there and your expertise. I do want to talk more about Bootstrap Legal because I think you guys are doing some pretty interesting things. In addition to your smart contract stuff, it also mentions on your website, a bunch of different funding structures like Reg D and Reg CF and Reg A+. And there's a lot of different funding structures people could take other than, doing an ICO or some other kind of, financial offering. Is this something that you guys are helping people do?
So I do not, but I do refer folks over to my securities attorney's friends, right? I'm just trying to get into the business of being scalable and making money in a scalable way, as opposed to, what I was doing previously, which was very services oriented, and where you have to bill by the hour.
Definitely.
I do know all of this stuff, and I'm happy to refer folks to attorneys that might be able to be a good match based on their budget, their geographic location, their goal, whatever it is. But I wanted to go back to something you just mentioned, which is, there are different ways to structure this ICO, and that's absolutely true, right? Which securities law you decide to go ahead and use as your regulatory exemption or whatnot in order to offer your token sale in the United States to U.S. investors, that matters. There is an art around regulatory strategy, right? And it used to be that really one of the most popular, one of the only ways was that you could only offer it to mostly accredited investors, up to 35 non-accredited investors, and you were not allowed to generally solicit. That's SEC or securities law speak for advertising, right? You weren't even allowed to advertise it, and that was the law for so many decades until basically the Jobs Act came along, and the Jobs Act came out with basically 3 crowdfunding regulations. That's Regulation D, Rule 506C, which allows for accredited crowdfunding, right? So accredited investors only, you raise as much as you want, but you are allowed to generally advertise and solicit, and that's the regulatory exemption that, for example, Filecoin and Blockstack used, I think.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the second one is Regulation A+. That's really meant to be a mini IPO. So suddenly you can advertise, you can raise money from the crowd, so non-accredited investors, but you are limited to $50 million every 12 months. There is a reason why they call this a mini IPO, right? It's not the easiest process in the world because you do actually need to get your deal approved by the SEC. It needs to specifically be qualified with the SEC, and that's a process that can take, sometimes even half a year, depending on what you're trying to do.
Wow.
And then the last one is regulation crowdfunding, or Reg CF for short. And that's really for more early stage, smaller size deals, right? You can advertise, you can take money from the crowd, but you can only raise up to $1 million and change every 12 months. Now, Congress is looking at upping the limits for some of these regulations in terms of how much you can raise, the different ways you can structure it. but they're not quite there yet with the changes. So I wouldn't quite count on them. But I just want people to be aware that if there were ever an easier time to raise money prior to, the 1930s, I mean, after the 1930s, prior to the 1930s, you could kind of do whatever you wanted, which resulted in the Great Depression, right? But if there were if there were ever an easier way to be doing this for the past 90-ish years, that would be, right now, because basically in the past couple years, the SEC has opened it considerably. So I always, online, I hear a lot of disgruntled, regulations suck, blah, blah, blah. But right now is the easiest time it's ever been to have a lot of freedom in fundraising. So I feel like people should also be very grateful.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, towards the beginning of the call, these new crowdfunding laws, which kind of enabled all this to happen. And I think, did it also enable Kickstarter to happen, or did that not require any legislation?
This is a very good question. Now, there are different types of crowdfunding, right? And I see ICOs, or a lot of them, at least as a subset of crowdfunding. Now, when you think about a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo type campaign, that's what we call rewards-based crowdfunding, right? I give you $5, and in return, you tweet out a message to me as a shout out, or I get the first version of your widget. There's also, GoFundMe type websites where that's technically donation-based crowdfunding, right? I give you $5, and in return, I get back good, happy feelings about myself, right? What we're really talking about today is investment crowdfunding, and that is you give me $5, I give you back some sort of return on investment. So that's the
interesting. Okay. Right. So it is almost that expectation of return that probably then classifies it as a security in some way.
Exactly. Right. And so if it is, a security, it's regulated by the SEC. To the extent it's not, it's still regulated, but that can be, for example, by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, right? And they are much more specifically worried about unfair, deceptive trade practices. So basically, when you're committing fraud.
Okay, interesting. And that's another interesting point about all this. I mean, it's not just the SEC that is involved. There are all these different, branches of government in the U.S. especially where they all kind of treat these things differently. The SEC is looking at a lot of these tokens as potential securities offerings. And I believe it was not FINRA.
CFTC?
Maybe the CFTC. Somebody many years ago had actually deemed, Bitcoin and other things as property, and was, we're trying to pass some kind of law to basically pay personal property tax on cryptocurrencies. But it's been interesting to see kind of how all these different regulatory bodies consider it something else. Just cryptocurrency in general, I think they're still kind of wrapping their head around in some way. I saw this post on Twitter that was a panel where there were people from the SEC talking on this panel just kind of about regulation in the ICO space, and they had made it very clear that they were still in intake mode, still kind of absorbing a lot of information, figuring out, where these ICOs are coming from, who is running them, how they should approach this whole situation. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how a lot of these things are cleared up or clarified as we move forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the important thing to add there, right, is that I think one of the reasons why there is so much regulatory confusion is because cryptocurrency and coins and tokens take the form of so many different things. They can act in so many different ways, right? So whereas one token might represent an interest in a fund, another token is really a payment mechanism, and another token allows you to have credit for some sort of service, and another token is membership in a decentralized network, right? So because they represent so many different things, I think it's very difficult to say, oh, tokens are blank, right? It's really, what does the token do, and what does it allow you to do, and what do you use it for? That's the underlying question. The technology doesn't matter. It's the behavior that matters.
Absolutely. And do you think that somebody will make that easier? Is that the SEC's job that they're going to come out and make it much easier for people to understand whether their token offering is a security, or is that going to be somebody like you with Bootstrap Legal where you come out with some tool that makes it easy for people to understand?
So what I think is going to happen in the next couple years is that people are going to start classifying coins and tokens based on their function, right? So you will have pure utility tokens. You will have membership tokens. You will have equity tokens. I think there will be different types of tokens, and then it'll be much more easy to figure out, okay, under what rules and regulations does all this fall under?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. It'll, with these things, it's so interesting to hear perspectives, especially from, lawyers, from attorneys like yourself. So I really do appreciate all the insight. It's always great to hear. And I think a lot of other people, people that I've spoken with off of the podcast would definitely agree with you and say that there are going to be these classifications of tokens. So that's really great insight. Is there anything else you want to add about Bootstrap Legal, about yourself, before we wrap the show up?
No, not really. I think that's about it. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but I guess we have limited time.
Definitely, yeah. But I do want to give you a chance to talk more about Bootstrap Legal. Talk more about yourself. Where can people contact you? Where can they find out more about Bootstrap if they're interested?
Yeah, sure. So they can find me and Bootstrap Legal on all the social media channels. Our website is bootstraplegal.com. If they go there and they click on the smart contract button, they can sign up on our wait list or sign up on our newsletter to get more information about stuff that we're pushing out. Or if they want to partner with us because they're building, some sort of blockchain project that runs a lot and relies on smart contracts, that would be awesome. I, tend to post a lot of my thoughts and updates in the space on LinkedIn, so people can follow me there. The only thing I'll say is that I get a lot of random LinkedIn requests that, and then tons of them are always trying to sell me services. So to the extent that people try to connect with me, I would, ask them that they write a note or something like that, so I know that they're not just spam.
Yeah, please don't spam Amy, guys. She's busy as it is, so get in touch with her if you're interested, but certainly don't spam her. But Amy, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, sincerely appreciate the insight, and I'm sure many of our listeners will as well. Thank you, and best of luck with Bootstrap Legal moving forward.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to request someone to be on the podcast in the future, tweet us at ICO Alert and let us know. Most of our guests are requests from listeners just like you, so we review every single recommendation that comes through in our Twitter feed. We'll look at everything. So if there's a lesser-known project that you think we should cover, let us know. Maybe we'll have them on the podcast. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and be the first to hear our new episodes. And also, don't forget to check out ICOalert.com to see the only comprehensive list of active and upcoming ICOs. I'm your host, Robert Finch, and I'll be back next week with a brand new episode.